If you understand your mind itself as a domain of war, as a domain of contestation, then the onus becomes on every person to start to degauss their minds and to decolonize their brains, not let their minds become occupied territory for the propagation of, militarized subkinetic propaganda. Once you've done that, then you can start to connect to other people, start to have dialogues, start to build solidarity, and then think concretely about what are the next steps that have to be taken.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Fiona Edwards, and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. This month, we are focusing on fundraising for the year ahead. We'll be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and the full episode on our Patreon for members to watch in full. So please help us sustain our work by becoming members of Patreon today. And as it is a podcast, of course, you can also find us on Spotify and Amazon Music.
Our amazing guest today for Global Majority for Peace podcast is KJ No. KJ No is a peace activist, journalist, and scholar who specializes in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is widely recognized for his critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy and East Asian affairs, particularly regarding China and the Korean Peninsula. And of course, he's also the co-host and producer of the China Report on Breakthrough News. Welcome, KJ.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we'd just like to start by hearing a little bit more about yourself. Could you start with telling us, about the origin of your politicization? Was there any particular incident that has led you to your worldview today?
That's both a difficult question and a hard one because it's hard to know where to start. And I think there's kind of a difference between activists in the global north and the global south. I think in the global north, I think that there is probably some kind of a conversion story or conversion moment where, there's a Damascene event and something that woke you from your dogmatic slumbers. I see it a little bit different in the global south. You don't need a conversion story because you are born into struggle. You have to struggle. It's a little bit like asking a firefighter, why are you a firefighter? And of course, the TED Talk version is I saw a firefighter rescue a cat out of a tree, and it inspired me for the rest of my life. And on the other hand, in the global south, we say we are firefighters because there is a global fire consuming the world right now, and we cannot sit on our hands and watch. We are all volunteer firefighters right now. There's a fire going on. And that means that all of us need to put our shoulders to the wheel and start taking action.
It's a really interesting way to put it, and I completely agree with that. I've never actually heard it put that way before, so thank you for that. But you, as we have mentioned, are a co-host and co-producer for the China Report on Breakthrough News with Amanda Yi, who we also had on Global Majority for Peace earlier this year. It's a really informative show focusing on promoting understanding China and cutting through Western propaganda. On one of the episodes, I remember that you mentioned Orville Schell, who worked for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia from 1964 to 1965 during the anti-communist Washington-led campaign that led to the mass disappearing of an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Indonesian communists and leftists. He then went on to become the dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, and now is the director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations. It's just so amazing to have that history, to be really proud of it, that it's on his resume. And it just made me think about how vast the soft power apparatus is of the U.S. Another example of this is Johnny Harris, who has a YouTube channel with almost 7 million subscribers. He had a stint at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a prominent DC think tank. Can you help us unpack the mechanisms behind US soft power, the US soft power ecosystem, and also what have you found to be the most effective strategies to counter this?
Okay, another great question. I mean, the first thing to say is that it's truly insidious. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate how far-reaching and how deep the propaganda goes. People in the West are the most propagandized people in the world. And part of the problem is that they think they're not propagandized. During the Cold War, there's a joke, a Russian agent, a Soviet agent is going to the United States to study propaganda. And his seatmate says, "What propaganda?" And he says, "That's my point." So it's that line from Baudelaire: the devil's greatest trick is convincing the world that he didn't exist. The greatest coup of Western propaganda is convincing its population that it is not propagandized. So it's really an uphill task. But I just want to tap very lightly on Orville Schell. So Orville Schell is the great authority under heaven on all things China in the Western media. He is the person that they talk to when they have any questions about China's governance or China's human rights or China's policy. And there's an interesting little piece in his curriculum vitae, which you can look up on his own website. Between 1964 and 1966, he was the training associate for the Ford Foundation, now in Indonesia. Now, that seems like a very kind of innocuous line in his resume, but if you go to the Ford Foundation reports for 1965, you'll see that because of operating difficulties, the office in Indonesia was closed. Now, what does that mean? There were operating difficulties when Orville Schell was there. It means that there was a literal genocide. As you point out, at least 500,000, probably close to 1 million. Some say 1.5 million. The streets were running with blood. You could hear the shrieks across the country. The rivers were clogged with bodies. They were running crimson with human blood. And Orville Schell was working for the Ford Foundation during that exact period when this complete and total genocide was going on. Well, what was the Ford Foundation at the time? It was an annex of the CIA. The chairman of the Ford Foundation was a man called John McCloy, who, among other things, founded the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. And from 1958 until 1965, he was the chair of the Ford Foundation, and he essentially turned the Ford Foundation into an annex of the CIA. And one of the things that they did was they ran the trainings for the leaders and the genocidaires who were committing this mass atrocity in Indonesia. And so Orville Schell was right in the thick of it. It would have been impossible not to know what was going on. So the Ford Foundation was directly involved in training the genocidaires, and these were considered to be communists, but a lot of them were actually ethnic Chinese. And so after this period, he goes back to the United States and he founds a boutique meat slaughterhouse called Neiman Ranch. It still is in operation today. If you get haute California cuisine, that's where you get your meat from. Okay. So he founded this meat slaughterhouse, farming and slaughtering operation. And their claim to fame is that they slaughter animals humanely. They very rarely use, quote unquote, a safety stun, meaning they very rarely electrocute them. They actually gas them to death. And then after running this slaughterhouse, then he goes on to found a similar sausage making corporation known as the UC Berkeley School of Journalism, and then cultivates an entire generation of anti-China bashing journalists. And along the way, he's constantly propagating the myth, especially after Xi Jinping, of this, authoritarian country involved in cultural genocide. So you can't make this stuff up. There's a way in which there's a organic logic in what this person has done. And then to compound the hypocrisy, he later got involved in the last bastion of missionary liberal white racism, which is environmentalism or environmental protection. And, the irony of this is that his work in Indonesia is exactly what opened Indonesia up to this kind of neoliberal resource extraction, which, for example, had 60% of Asia's rainforest prior to the entry of US timber and mining and oil corporations. So the hypocrisy just goes on, but it is so deep and so involved. He and Larry Diamond, who is the kind of the eminence grise of the NED, were also the conveners of a racist McCarthyite China bashing fest at Hoover, which argued for constructive vigilance against Chinese Americans. In other words, that the Chinese Americans were a fifth column. And we saw, the results of that with the massive assaults and beatings and attacks on Chinese. So all of this is to say that there's a truly deep and insidious ecosystem of propaganda that has very, very deep roots down to the core of the Cold War. Orville Schell's father was the founder of Helsinki Watch, which was the massive PSYOP, the propaganda campaign against the USSR. And he's named after his father. He's Orville Schell Jr. So anyway, it just goes on and on. Johnny Harris, of course, we call him CIA Johnny Harris. He's involved in all kinds of disinformation. Every so often, he throws in a nice, National Geographic type video in there, kind of seeming to take both sides. But what he's really doing is he's mixing in the fecal matter into the hamburger so that you don't know what you're getting. And I remember one of his videos was all about how there is no such thing as China. China is an invention of the CPC, or the CCP as they like to call it. And it doesn't really exist. And it was just a ideological construct, and there's no such thing as, thousands of years of Chinese history, just disparate, fiefdoms and feudal warring lords. So this is the kind of stuff that you're looking at. So then, what is the way to respond to this? I mean, the easy answer is critical thinking, but the critical thinking is not easy because what we are facing is this huge ideological deluge. They literally refer to it as the fire hose of falsehoods. This is Rand's corporation's term with it. But what it ensures is that, again, sorry for the metaphor, but Karl Marx refers to ideology as a camera obscura, like it's a dark room with a pinhole. And through that pinhole, an image is projected on the wall. And the image you get is upside down. So this is kind of the world in which the propagandized West inhabits. That is to say, you're kept in the dark and there's a tiny, tiny pinhole and you get information about the world, but it's completely inverted. It's the up is down, left is right, black is white. Now, this is the world that we're looking at. And so we're constantly subjected to this. And there's such a kind of a narrow bandwidth where you can try and find some accurate information. So first you have to approach what you're being fed with extreme skepticism. In the United States, there's this woman called Amy Goodman. She's like the Johnny Harris of the liberal left. She does the same mixture of hamburger with fecal matter, and people eat it up. They swallow it wholesale. The entire apparatus, Mehdi Hassan, Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, these are all propaganda operations. They criticize China for human rights. Can you imagine a monarchy, a theocratic monarchy, criticizing a people's republic, quote unquote, for human rights issues? But anyway, this is what we're up against. So there are a couple of things that we have to do. The first is a kind of radical skepticism. The second thing, and this is more of a state level intervention, but countries have to exert a kind of digital sovereignty. They have to have sovereignty over their own digital space. Because if they don't, they're going to be cooed, propagandized, indoctrinated, and overthrown. And then, for people in the global north or, in the core of the propaganda machine, it's much harder, but the stakes are also much, much more important because you have to understand that you are either propagating the propaganda or you can be a barrier to it. So what that requires is a kind of really concerted individual attempt to kind of degauss your mind and to really restart thinking critically about everything that you're being told and everything that you're being fed, certainly in the mainstream media, certainly on the global media platforms, the social media platforms, which are all controlled by the United States for the most part, the Silicon Valley dirtbag class. It's their, global panopticon that they run for the benefit of the ruling imperial class. And then to understand that if you understand your mind itself as a domain of war, as a domain of contestation, then the onus becomes on every person to start to degauss their minds and to decolonize their brains, not let their minds become occupied territory for the propagation of, militarized subkinetic propaganda. Once you've done that, then you can start to connect to other people, start to have dialogues, start to build solidarity, and then think concretely about what are the next steps that have to be taken.
Well, that was such a rich answer. And I think the point you raised around digital sovereignty just really struck me as so important. I mean, if we look at what's been happening over the last decade or so in Latin America, the way in which platforms like WhatsApp have been weaponized to get the far right in power, for example, in Brazil with Bolsonaro, that was like such a huge part of the coup there, the use of social media to kind of spread disinformation. And as you say, where do these platforms sort of owned by? Who are they owned by? The Western billionaires, essentially. So just on the topic of US propaganda, just to kind of do more of a deep dive into a specific area where, there is a blanket kind of coverage in one direction, which is the really negative and unchallenged US propaganda narrative against the DPRK. We recently had a guest from No Tudol, and they debunked a lot of the myths that there are about North Korea in terms of starvation, depiction of the country as warmongering and belligerent, and also highlighted the historical ties that there are between China and North Korea. So could you offer us some insight into the current relationship between these countries, and how much is China able to counter the crippling US sanctions? And in terms of this, in the context of China having completed its poverty alleviation program in recent years, I wonder if you could reflect on that for us.
Yeah, so again, very, very rich question. The relations between Korea and China go back millennia. You could actually say that the reason why China itself was colonized was a result of the Sino-Japanese War, which most people may or may not know. It was fought in 1894, but it was fought on the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese were beginning their colonization of Korea. There were factions in the Korean government that did not want Japanese colonization. One of them was the wife of the last emperor of Korea. Her name was Myeongseong Hwanghu, the Empress Myeongseong. And she was a kind of, if you will, a Korean proto-feminist. She sent her cousin to the West, came back. Cousin told her, we're in a bad place. The West is advanced. and she understood that it was time for Korea to modernize, but they also needed to prevent it from being colonized. And Japan had already gotten its claws into Korea, and it was going the way of the Western colonial powers. They had taken on, Bismarck, the model of Bismarckian Germany, adapted their military strategies and technology, and they were beginning to expand in Asia as a colonial power, very much in the way of the Western colonial powers. So the Empress Myeongseong was deeply opposed to Japanese colonization, and she was trying to balance with the other powers that were vying for access to the Korean Peninsula. Because if you look at Korea, it's like literally a little stepping stone onto China, and all the imperial powers understood that China was the big prize that they wanted, including Japan itself. Japan has always attacked China by way of Korea. So I'm getting very long-winded here. But anyway, Myeongseong Hwang-hu was slaughtered. She was attacked by 60 Japanese samurai in the imperial palace, and she was gang raped and then set on fire while she was still alive, doused with kerosene and set on fire. And so that was the beginning of the Japanese relationship with Korea. And then later, when the Japanese came into Korea, they took one of the summer palaces, the Changyang Palace, and they turned it into a zoo and filled it with monkeys. So I think that gives you a sense of, what the colonial agenda was. But during this period, the anti-Japanese Korean leadership appealed to China for help. And so China responded and sent troops to help liberate the capital that was being overrun with pro-Japanese counter-revolutionaries. And because of this, the Japanese claimed that China had broken an agreement not to station troops, and they waged a war on the Korean Peninsula. And as a result of this war, Taiwan province was ceded to Japan as war booty. And then a large part of China called the Liaodong Peninsula was also given over to Japan. And then it was also the beginning of the colonization of Korea. So the colonization of Korea and the colonization of China are a dovetail with each other. And in 1919, millions of Koreans rose up in nonviolent protest against the Japanese colonization. It was, probably the largest nonviolent mobilization in human history at that time. And of course, what happened was that everybody was massacred. Tens of thousands of people were massacred. And so at that point, the Koreans who were resisting Japanese colonization went in multiple directions, but there was a significant group that went north to northern China, what was then referred to as Manchuria, and they started guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. And so this was among these guerrilla leaders, there was a man who was kind of the Che Guevara of these guerrilla warfare in that region. His name was Kim Il-sung. These irregular forces then later joined up with the precursors to the Chinese People Liberation Army, and they fought in Manchuria against the Japanese and helped liberate China from the Japanese. And so there were entire divisions of Korean fighters that fought for the liberation of China. And then having helped China win back its liberation, they went back to North Korea. And then not very long after, a war broke out on the peninsula because the US had prevented the Koreans from creating their own state. And then so China sent, again, as a redux of 1894, sent troops to support Korea, or in this case, North Korea, against the Western invasion. So that relationship is so deep and so tight that people don't understand how extraordinary that relationship it is. But just to give you a few, anecdotes, there was a moment when Kim Jong-un, the current leader, had to travel in order to meet with Donald Trump. And if I'm not mistaken, this was in Vietnam. And when he did this, he took the train. He usually rides in a kind of a slow armored train. And so he had to go from, North Korea all the way across China and then into Southeast Asia. And this happened at the period which was the most important public holiday of China when everybody, when 500 million people are taking trains going to their hometown. And what China did was it stopped that migration so that Kim's train could go through. It was literally Moses parting the sea in order that he could do his diplomatic business. So this is one signal of, the kind of respect that China accords its relationship with North Korea and the North Korean leader. And North Korea is the only country that China has a mutual defense treaty with. It has no mutual defense treaties with any other countries. It is the only country that to this day it still has a defense treaty with, mutual defense treaty. So a war against North Korea is a war against China and vice versa. So I think that, just gives you a sense. But anyway, when they greeted him recently, a few years back, they quoted a classical Korean text called Yongbyo-cheonga. It means, dragon flies up to the heavens. And it's one of the most important texts in the Korean language, bar none. It is literally the text of the Korean language. It's the first text that was ever written in the Korean language. And it starts out by saying, a tree that has deep roots will not be destroyed in a drought, nor will it bend in the wind. And when they said this, they read this text as they were addressing the meeting with Kim Jong-un, which is a kind of a deep affirmation of the legitimacy of North Korea, as well as its resilience and power and their deep respect for it. So anybody who tells you anything different, is reading from the US propaganda line. They would like you to believe that North Korea is a propagandized carceral, one large concentration camp, and everybody's just raving to rush out of it. But no, it is a deeply militarized state, and they've had to do that. It's built like a maroon society. Maroon societies are, societies that were built by escaped slaves. So they have a deep kind of discipline, which involves a kind of a capacity and willingness to fight for their existence. But it is not the dystopian hellhole that the West would like you to believe that it is, although they have tried very, very hard to turn it into that. Just one more, little anecdote or data point. Until 1979, North Korea was richer and more developed than South Korea. And it was referred to by the Cambridge economist as the Korean miracle. The Korean miracle until 1979 was North Korea, not South.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.